Okay, when we read last, the Snakebird was at Marzana's front door wanting to see Mrs. Hackleberry. Chapter 20, the Snakebird. Both Marzana and Honora watched Mrs. Hackleberry as she looked thoughtfully down at the card. "He's actually downstairs?" she asked. "Alone?" "Well," Honora said, "never having met the gentleman before, I assume it's himself and no one with him. No." "Show him into the living room." Marzana's mother stood and slipped the card into her pocket. "Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes. Say I'm putting my daughter to bed." "Mom," Marzana protested, "come on." "Thank you, Honora," Mrs. Hackleberry said pointedly. "Aye, aye." Honora tapped her knuckles to her forehead, and a moment later her feet went drumming down again. Mrs. Hackleberry turned to Marzana. "What else? Quickly." "Come on," Marzana wheedled. I can be useful. Let me come down." "What else?" her mother repeated, patiently but urgently. "I don't have time to argue with you. What else about the Cormorants? The substitute teacher? Any place else you saw Victor's name? Anything you can think of." Marzana resisted the urge to stomp her foot. "The substitute's name is Brian Otterwill. He taught at Peony's school. Probably knew her from Comics Club. Probably was on the faculty of the camp. You know, the one with the party she was taken from that got its first week canceled. He's staying with Victor. I can't think of anything else." "Got it." Her mother headed for the door, then paused. She glanced over Marzana's head to the fireplace. "I presume you know how to listen in on the living room from in here?" Marzana, startled, began to sputter a denial. "Do it," Mrs. Hackleberry interrupted. "Pay attention. See if there's anything that strikes you. If there's a question I need to ask and I don't ask it, if there's anything you remember that you think I need to know before he leaves, write it down and ring for Honora." She pointed to an old bell pull by the door, one of the remnants of Hedgehog Court's fancy house days. "Understood?" Marzana managed to nod, and her mother stalked out of the study. Not quite believing her luck, she went over to the fireplace and crouched beside the grate. She would have snooped anyway, of course, but being invited to listen in felt like a big step away from the exclusion of deniability. "Except it's not," a tiny voice of reason muttered silently in her brain. "Your mom isn't confident she had time to hear everything you know, and she can't risk missing an opportunity. As soon as this conversation's over, you'll be shut out again." "I don't care," Marzana retorted silently. "It's a step, and for now—" Her mother's voice in the living room below interrupted her thoughts. "Victor? Barbara?" The Snakebird's voice was surprising. Marzana would have expected the voice of this master intelligencer and possible master evildoer to be either deep, unctuous, whoa, what is that word? And probably British accented, like a Bond villain, or, considering he was old enough to have a great-nephew of Mr. Otterwill's age, old and brittle and venomous. It was neither. Victor Cormorant said Marzana's mother's name in an almost youthful tenor voice, and in tones that perfectly telegraphed a whole world of information. The fact that he knew Barbara wasn't her real name, that he knew perfectly well what her real name was, and that he always felt a bit silly using this false one. But what could you do? The niceties had to be observed, even if it was all a bit ridiculous considering who he was. So much information in a single word. So polite and so condescending. Marzana felt herself stiffening with offense on her mom's behalf. If Mrs. Hackleberry was insulted, she didn't let her own voice hint at it, though Marzana was certain her mother had heard every degree of the very subtle shade Cormorant had thrown into his pronunciation of her name. "To what do I owe the personal visit?" she asked politely. "I hear the kidnapping victim was recovered tonight. Congratulations." "Thank you. Yes, she was." "And is she well?" "She seemed to be, yes, though I didn't get to speak to her much. Presumably she's on her way home by now." "Good." With the niceties out of the way, the visitor didn't beat around the bush. "I would like to know why someone saw fit to ask the young lady if she had heard her kidnappers use my name." "Your name?" Mrs. Hackleberry repeated, and Marzana clapped a hand over her own mouth to keep from cursing. Why hadn't it occurred to her to tell her mother she'd asked Peony that? Once the girl finally started answering questions, of course, she would have mentioned it to the police, and she had been asked about someone named Victor Cormorant. And if the Snakebird was really the master carrier everyone said he was, he'd certainly have contacts in law enforcement. The only surprising thing was how quickly his network had reported back. Meanwhile, Marzana's mom had barely broken stride for a second. Why wouldn't they have asked her that? I told you when I called last night that your name had been mentioned by the man who reached out to me on account of the information used to blackmail the officer at the jail. Anytime anyone has unlikely information in this town, someone assumes it came from the Snakebird. Except from what I hear, and here again his tone spoke volumes. This is not merely what I have heard, that tone said. This is what I know. The girl was not asked whether she'd heard the Snakebird mentioned. She was asked if she'd heard the name Victor Cormorant. Furthermore, it was not one of the police officers who put the question to her. It was your daughter. Marzana thought she might vomit. For a moment, nothing but silence filtered up through the fireplace grate. Then her mother spoke again, her voice steady as ever. My daughter went to that apartment because it was her teacher's home. The teacher, your great-nephew, Brian, has been subbing for over the past 4 days because you recommended him. The scuttlebutt among the students at Merrymead is that there was something not quite right about the teacher's absent, and my daughter's not stupid. Now, Mrs. Huckleberry said, and there was a hint of a smile in the word, if you're asking me how a handful of students knew that the substitute teacher had been hired on your recommendation, well, as a trustee, and I presume a very rich man, I imagine you could arrange to update the locks on the school's filing cabinets. Fair enough, Cormorant said with a chuckle, and I'm not a trustee, but I'll pass the suggestion on to Tasha. Oh, that's right, Mrs. Huckleberry said. I forgot Tasha is the Cotgrave trustee at Merrymead these days. A very slight pause then. Speaking of Tasha, I tried to get a hold of her before I called you. I thought since this was a downhill crime, and downhill is more her territory, she might have some insights. Used a couple emergency channels, in fact, but no luck. How's she doing these days? Fine, I believe, Cormorant replied smoothly. Next time I hear from her, I'll remind her that to keep luminaries such as yourself waiting is perhaps bad for business. Another momentary silence, and then, on the subject of business, Violet, there is something I feel I need to say before I leave this room. There was no condescension in the way he said her name this time. It took Marzana a full 3 seconds to realize with opened mouth shock that Victor Cormorant had used her mother's true one. Go ahead, Mrs. Huckleberry said evenly. My business is information, he said. Carefully, and I have spent my lifetime cultivating sources and methods. It's rare that I find myself surprised by the outcomes of my work. I am, I suppose, not surprised that my nom de guerre came up during fact-finding discussions downhill. I was, however, shocked that it would have come up in connection to this matter in any other way. If it happened, as you say, because I put Brian's name forward for a meaningless job, then... His voice trailed off, and Marzana imagined Cormorant shrugging, the gesture as eloquent as his cultured voice. But if it didn't... I think I understand, Marzana's mom's voice said after a moment. Thank you. No need, Mrs. Huckleberry replied briskly. Can I do anything else for you? Not a thing. They were both speaking further from the fireplace now and closer to the door. Apparently the strange interview was over. Anyhow, I know where to find you if anything else comes up. Marzana shuddered a little. His voice was less distinct now as they moved out of the living room, but it was impossible not to read the hint of a threat in those words. She crouched there for another moment or two, listening with her back up against the bricks and her knees drawn up to her chest. Then she scrambled to her feet and nearly broke her neck as she leaped out of the fireplace and tripped over the rug on her way to the window across the study, the one that overlooked Crossing Lane. Because the turret projected a short way out over the street and blocked any view of the front door, there was nothing to see for a moment. Then a man appeared on the street below. He was tall and unbent, like his voice. His posture was surprisingly youthful. He wore a pale linen suit and carried a walking stick in one hand. The other held a straw Panama hat, and he turned to glance back at Hedgelock Court as he put the hat on. Marzana slipped instinctively behind a curtain as his eyes turned upward toward the study window, as if he knew he'd spot someone there. That man's what my father would have called a real piece of work, Mrs. Huckleberry's voice said from behind her tiredly. Marzana turned and blew out a deep breath. I'm sorry, Mom. I did ask Peony that. I completely forgot. Mrs. Huckleberry waved a hand. She dropped back into the chaise and collapsed against the high back. You gave me what I needed to explain it. I gather Peony's answer was no, by the way. Marzana started to nod, then shook her head. She wouldn't answer at all. Not that question or any other one I asked. And you heard everything just now? Anything new occur to you? No, except you never told me what he said that sent you to Mrs. Aggervan's apartment in the first place. Marzana sat in the other big chair, remembered she'd just been crouching in the fireplace, jumped up and brushed herself off, then sat again. It sounded like he didn't actually know she'd gone missing after the first day. It did sound that way, didn't it? Mrs. Huckleberry ran her fingers over the scalp, which made her hair pop out of her braid in oddball lumps. He might not have. He didn't point us to that apartment. He pointed you to the station? Yes, but indirectly. I called him to inquire about the blackmail evidence Emmett had wanted to ask him about. He said he knew nothing about that, but suggested we talk to another information specialist who happened to be in the Liberty, one of Emmett's suspects, Hickson Blunt, who he said had been holed up at Whipping Hyde. But Cormorant said we ought to hurry because Hickson might be about to leave the Liberty again. Now, I doubt Blunt's aware the below ground still runs, but he probably knows where the old stations are, and we thought he might try to take one of the tunnels out of town. So your dad went out to the Copbone Alley station last night to see whether it looked like anyone had been in or out of it recently. When he got there, it was evident that the apartment above was occupied and by someone who wasn't answering the bell. He called me. We decided to do a little watching and waiting, and you know the rest. Footsteps on the stairs. Not Honora's this time, so probably Marzana's dad was home. It was always a bit of a wonder to Marzana that his footfalls were so much quieter than the steward's stomping treads. He came in, walked straight to the TV cabinet, and found the remote. Then he turned and gestured with it at the window. Did I just pass who I think I passed in the lane? In fact, yes, Mrs. Huckleberry replied. Tell you about it in a minute. You're back earlier than I expected. He dropped heavily onto the end of the chaise. Wasn't much to do. Peony didn't want to talk, and then, of course, once her parents got there, they just wanted to get her straight home. He snapped his fingers as if remembering something. Marzana, the detective in charge, wants to know, was that rope the only restraint holding Peony? There weren't say, zip ties or anything sturdier? Marzana shook her head. Just the rope. You're sure? Positive, Marzana insisted. I cut her loose myself. She'd have had some significant marks where she was tied if the kidnappers had used plastic, wouldn't she? Mrs. Huckleberry asked, frowning. She would have, and she didn't. Marzana's dad replied. The marks were consistent with the rope from the scene. I think the cops just wanted to make sure. There's something so old-fashioned about using rope, and risky, particularly on someone with such small hands and feet. Kids are natural escapists. He gave his daughter a dark look, and Marzana mentally girded herself for a second round of potentially catching heck. Just because the first round hadn't materialized didn't mean she was in the clear. But instead, Mr. Huckleberry turned on the TV and focused his attention there. A handful of reporters showed up. Mrs. Huckleberry's eyes narrowed. Reporters? Marzana's dad nodded as he changed the channel. Her mom leaned back, arms folded again, and stared upward. Well, that's as odd as a three-legged duck. Yep. Why? Marzana asked. Her father cracked a grim, unamused smile. Ah, questions from the auxiliary team. Marzana flushed. It's odd because the only way they'd have known to show up was if someone had called them and convinced them there was something newsworthy to report. Remember that the kidnapping hasn't been made public. Hadn't, he corrected himself, turning back to the TV and changing stations until the screen showed a coiffed woman, that's a good word too, coiffed, in a suit standing in front of a window piled with yarn that Marzana recognized as belonging to the shop just down the road from Autumn Stalls. People in the Liberty guard their privacy, and they tend to err on the side of respecting other people's privacy. Yet somehow a TV station and 2 newspapers had representatives turn up within 15 minutes of the cops, basically right after you left. Mr. Huckleberry turned the sound down low. One of the neighbors could have rung up a news tip hotline. Must have. But what made them think that anything worth reporting on was happening? A couple kids walking through the front door? 2 adults going in after them? Oh, which reminds me. He reached into his back pocket and tossed a small object to Marzana. Miraculously, she caught it one-handed, though she almost lost some cider in the process. It was a deck of playing cards with gleaming black and gold backs, bound with a rubber band. Thought your marksman friend might like to have those back, Marzana's father said. They look expensive. Anyway, if Mrs. Agravant had been some kind of recluse, maybe 4 strangers going into her flat would have been odd enough to make a neighbor call the police. Maybe, but I kind of doubt it. And in fact, nobody else did call the police, just you. But no way does 4 strangers going into an apartment immediately make anyone call the press, particularly if they didn't bother to call the cops first. So, then it must have been the police showing up that made somebody call the hotline, Marzana guessed. He shook his head again. A cop car pulling up outside with a siren on usually gets people to come out for a closer look. But call the papers? Not a chance. And even if someone did call the media, the caller would have had to convince them that whatever was happening was worth reporting. And yet the press turned up within minutes of Peony being found. So either a suspicious neighbor started contacting newspapers right about when you went in the door and very rapidly convinced the press that something crazy was happening, or a person who had real knowledge of the actual incident was behind the calls. Another rum thing, apparently. Did any of the reporters have anything to say about it? Marzana's mom asked. I heard one tell the lieutenant her newsroom got a vague but compelling anonymous tip. He frowned at the image on TV. That's not the Liberty. The scene on the screen had shifted, and now a different reporter stood in front of the kind of house that Marzana had never seen in Gamerbund, a private home that was a single freestanding structure with an actual lawn of its own and crowded only by gnarled trees. And at the moment, a lot of people. Some kind of press conference was taking place. An overwrought man in his 40s stood next to an equally emotional woman as she spoke into one of the dozen microphones pointed at her face. Those are the Hydes, Mrs. Huckleberry said. Coles and his people got Peony and her folks home fast. I bet his security detail cleared the roads between here and the printer's quarter, Mr. Huckleberry said, eyes on the screen as he turned up the volume. Difficult for all of us, the ashen Mrs. Hyde was saying. We've decided to take some time away as a family. We ask you to respect our privacy, Peony's privacy. A dozen voices shouted Mr. Hyde's name. Mr. Hyde, can you tell us, the most persistent shouted, whether this means you're withdrawing from the mayoral race? Winston Hyde nodded, his face paper white. Yes, I'm withdrawing to spend some time so that we can be together as a family, as Mariah said. He reached for his wife's hand. We'll be leaving Nagspeak tomorrow. My campaign will make a formal announcement tonight. Thank you. That's all we have to say until then. Several of the reporters went on shouting. A couple asking where they were going, 1 or 2 asking where Peony was and if they would be allowed to speak to her, and one loudly demanding to know who, if anyone, Winston Hyde would endorse now that he was no longer in the running. But the Hyde's security men were on the move, shepherding them toward their home and shoving reporters out of the way when they didn't move fast enough. Well, Mr. Huckleberry said, killing the sound and tossing the remote on the ottoman, I guess that's that. I guess so, replied Mrs. Huckleberry. Both comments rang a bit hollow to Marzana's ears, but she couldn't quite put her finger on the precise sentiment there. Was it annoyance? Dissatisfaction? Over on the big table desk, the phone rang. Mr. Huckleberry crossed the room and picked up the receiver. Huckleberry's? He was silent for a moment. Tomorrow's fine. See you at 11:30. He hung up. Cybuck, he said in answer to Mrs. Huckleberry's questioning glance. Debrief, or whatever you want to call it. He glanced toward the window. What about Cormorant? What's your read on the situation? Was he in play? Marzana's mother made a face. Honestly, this is crazy, but I truly think he was in play to the same extent that Rob was. Mr. Huckleberry frowned dubiously. Never mind all the coincidences that would require. You honestly think Victor Cormorant, the Snakebird, lets himself get used as a pawn ever? It's entirely likely he's never been a pawn in his entire life, Mrs. Huckleberry acknowledged. But I also think it's just as possible there's a first time for everything. And this was his. I think he came here because he found out,
And don't get me started speculating on how this happened so fast. But he found out his name got dropped when we found the girl, and he wanted to tell me specifically he wasn't behind it. She shook her head in wonder. He came to our house himself, Peter, and with no muscle behind him. I think he was spooked. Marzana's dad's face was a mask of disbelief. Wow, he said, rubbing his chin. I don't know how to process that. His wife nodded. She stared at the flickering screen for a moment more, her elbows on her knees. I really wish they'd all been wrong, she muttered. I hoped. Then she got up and left the room. Marzana's father watched her go. Wrong about what? Marzana asked quietly. Wrong about the kidnappers having come to the Liberty, Mr. Hacklebaron said, his eyes on the empty doorway. Then he glanced at Marzana. Please don't ever pull a stunt like that again. It felt as if her stomach had been drop-kicked by someone in steel-toed shoes. She swallowed. Okay. Mr. Hacklebaron gave her a long look. You have no idea how far wrong that could have gone, have you? No, he snapped. Stop and really think about it. Think about all the different ways that could have gone belly up. How people could have been hurt. Do me the courtesy of at least taking 60 seconds and reflecting on how close you came to real trouble. He got to his feet. I need to eat something. Nyala called half an hour later. The phone rang only once. Marzana, sitting in the window nook in her bedroom, looked up sharply. A moment later, Mrs. Hacklebaron's voice barked from the study, where she and Marzana's dad had gone with their coffee. Marzana! Nyala's on the phone. Make it quick. Okay. Marzana darted across the room. Neither she nor Nyala said anything until they heard the click of the study extension being hung up. Then, how are you? Nyala asked breathlessly. Are you grounded? Nope. You? No. Well, I haven't precisely told my parents anything yet. What? Mars, what would I have told them? That you got me a copy of a note and I cut up a book? All that would have done is maybe get you deeper in trouble. If your mom calls mine, I'll deal with it then. Pause. She's probably going to call my mom, huh? I don't know. She and Dad seem pretty preoccupied. Marzana chewed on the edge of her sleeve. Have you guys talked to Amelia? What about the guys? It occurred to her that as the nominal leader of the thief knot, it probably should have been her job to call around to everyone, update them, and make sure they were okay. I should have done that, huh? Nyala made a sympathetic noise. Don't worry about it. JJ called me after he got home, and I figured you were catching heck, so I called Amelia. And JJ talked to Ciro? Yeah. Nyala paused again. I don't think Ciro's mom will ground him either. He loaned you a phone, so you'd be safer. And you used it to call the police when things didn't seem right. How's that irresponsible? Put it like that, it sounded perfectly reasonable, but Marzana was pretty certain none of the adults in question were going to frame what had happened in precisely that way. Not sure about JJ's folks, though, Nyala continued dubiously. They're a little overprotective, and I never actually spoke to Amelia. She didn't answer, the phone in her room, so I called the other number she gave us, the one for the common room, and I left a message with a Cormorancy kid named Hester. But she said she hadn't seen Amelia since dinner. She didn't sound like she thought that was particularly strange, though. I guess they used to each other going on walkabout in the school. I can try her again later if you want. I should probably do it. Why don't you delegate it to me, Nyala suggested. I have nothing else to do. All right. Are we still on for tomorrow? That was a good question. Yes, Marzana said after a moment, though. A moment's thought, even if all we do is debrief. Mom had an interesting visitor just after we got home. I guess you and Ciro didn't find any hidden messages, did you? Nyala's voice soured. He doesn't think there is one. Well, I guess it doesn't matter now, Marzana said, trying to be comforting. I guess not. Whatever. See you tomorrow, Mars. Marzana hung up the phone and walked over to the window corner. She sat and pulled her knees up to her chest. As she stared out of her view of a sliver of the Liberty of Gamerbund, glittering as it always did in the darkness, her eyes began to slide out of focus, and a reflection that wasn't her own shivered into visibility. Are you okay? Betty asked. Marzana shrugged. I don't know. Betty sat cross-legged at her side and held out Marzana's pink shoelace. Show me how to tie our knot. Marzana took the string. As efforts to cheer up a person go, this is pretty transparent. Also, I'm pretty sure you know more about knots than I do. Do it anyway. Betty leaned back against the window. It's what I've got at the moment. The next chapter is
called shell game.